Hi friends, I just thought I'd make a spontaneous video. Maybe I'll try and make a better one when I'm actually in housing and installed in my so-called monastery. But wishing you all a very happy festive season and new year. I just thought I'd share a little bit about what life is like as a nun on the outskirts of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, why I ordained, and, kind of the life of a nun, the joys and the sorrows, just a kind of short video. Um, my name's Ayeshe. I've been a nun for 20 years. I originally ordained in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Prior to ordaining, I studied Tibetan Buddhism for 7 years, and I helped run a Tibetan Buddhist center for 5 years, where I was the spiritual director of a Buddhist center in Sydney and worked closely with a Tibetan Buddhist Lama. So, first of all, being a Buddhist nun in the modern world um, is a fairly unusual thing to choose to do with your life. Um, most little girls don't kind of think when they grow up in the West, I'm going to be celibate and I'm going to um, kind of spend my life in meditation. A lot of people are really curious about what being a Buddhist nun is and what kind of people become Buddhist monastics. Um, Basically, I left home when I was 15. My father died, and it kind of pushed me into an existential crisis, made me think, what's the meaning of life? I became a hippie, because they seemed to be the people at the time for me who were most aligned with my belief that there is more to life than making money, and finishing school, where I was learning a lot of things that had nothing to do with dealing with my existential crisis, my depression at the loss of my father, or the conflict in my family. I started thinking life is fine. I could die anytime. My father died when he was 59. And, my family was fairly lower middle class. And, my parents did everything that people should do to be responsible citizens. They were good people. They saved their money, they paid their taxes. But, the death of my father just kind of think, well, surely there must be more to life than this. Forgive me also because I'm just holding my phone on my steering wheel, so it's a bit shaky. And, as a hippie, I found, people were experimenting with different religious traditions like yoga, shamanism, some pretty wacky things like breatharianism as well. And Buddhism was there on the outskirts as well. And they were really, the community that I was involved in near Byron Bay was very much into Osho. Oh, that's a can of worms there. Basically, then I went to India when I was 17, where I found Tibetan Buddhism. And for the first time in my life, I really had some answers to the philosophical quandaries I was in. I learned to meditate and still my mind. And for the first time in my life, I think I felt completely peaceful. And just learning about, the idea of compassion being the purpose of life, that everybody's been your mother in your past life, that we're all intimately connected, learning about the power of the mind, because there's so much of the mind that we don't actually use. And, we're always encouraged in the West to look outwardly and not to examine our inner reality and how our thoughts might affect our happiness and well-being. I felt that a lot of the people around me and myself weren't particularly happy pursuing materialism as a life goal, that a lot of people spent a great deal of their life in jobs they really didn't like, with people they had nothing in common with, simply just to survive, or because they felt they must. And I thought there must be a better way than that. And, the way we are living in capitalist societies, we're destroying the planet. The way we're living is not sustainable. And perhaps building communities, based on mutual care rather than a person being economically productive, is a better premise for society than kind of work until you die and if you don't conform, we'll make you homeless. Perhaps that's a questionable premise for a happy human existence. Yeah, so I ordained at 17. No, I went to India and I traveled around, and I saw a great deal of poverty as well as so much beauty and people surviving in very adverse conditions. I saw people, particularly sadhus and people who'd so-called renounced the world, living quite happily on very little. But at the same time, I don't think we should idealize poverty. Poor people are not necessarily more happy than rich people. We all need the basics to survive. But, there's a lot of research that says once you have achieved a livable wage, anything beyond that doesn't necessarily make you more happy. So it's an inner job. I came back to Australia and I felt that I should be responsible and, get a bit more money to travel and go back and meditate more, do more retreats. So I got a job in an insurance company, which I had for 4 years, which I was grateful for, and I was happy to pay taxes and pay back what I had lived off as a street kid. And it was nice to have some choices about where I could travel and what I could do with my money. I was very happy to facilitate a Buddhist community with my teacher and with all the other volunteers. And I really learned a great deal from my teacher, who ordained as a monk at the age of 8 as a Tibetan refugee in India. But after a few years running that center and then ordaining for the first year as a nun, I noticed that, the Western people who'd ordained in that temple were treated completely differently to the Tibetan Lama, who was held in high esteem. And I was kind of told by a visiting Lama, pray to be reborn as a as a man. And I just kind of realized that they expected women to accept their inferior status and to just serve and so-called burn off the bad karma of being a woman. I realized I was tied into a system with a lot of cultural baggage that had nothing to do with me and my own values and my own aspirations as a Western woman, and my belief that women have the same spiritual capacity as men, and that people can't thrive unless they have justice, unless they have the basics for living, kindness, respect, and so forth. And after a year of staying in that center, although I am very grateful for all the teachings I received, and I do really respect that Lama, I realized that, the tradition of charging Western monastics, because I was forced into a lay job, which is against the monastic vows, to pay rent to the center, which is a practice never heard of before in 2,600 years of Buddhist practice. And what I realized was I neither had the freedom of a lay person to go here and there to engage in a relationship or, sex or whatever, partying, and I had a less amount of money because I was giving most of my money to the temple and I was only working part-time, but I was not held with any kind of esteem by the lay community because they hadn't been educated to see the basic equality of everyone who ordains as a monastic. People would bring the Lama food and we ourselves were basically left to almost starve. And I realized to stay in that situation was to cooperate in my own dehumanization. But I also noticed, that being a monastic is can be a really joyful experience. It can give one's life a lot of purpose. I noticed that I was really thrown in the deep end. I wasn't prepared for so-called my own identity as a woman disappearing and this being replaced by this kind of big sign that says, I'm Buddhist, I represent Buddhism. If you have any questions or projections, approach me. So people, projected stuff, that they expect nuns to be peaceful all the time, to never raise their voice, to never question injustice. But I also found people who it cut out a lot of nonsense, in terms of people knew I was committed to the spiritual path, so they would approach me with questions and they would open up and tell me the deepest contents of their heart. So I found that I really needed to do a counseling course to deal with all the problems, the emotional problems and suffering people were coming to me with. And I found myself very quickly involved in volunteering to teach meditation in schools and rehab centers and prisons. But at the same time, even though the Buddhist community expected me to give teachings and turn up and run monasteries and facilitate retreats, they all assumed that there was some organization behind me supporting me like a Christian nun would have. And Buddhists in the West don't have that, especially because Tibetans are, traumatized refugees who basically come to the West to raise money and then take the money back to India for the Tibetans who they regard as so-called the real practitioners. And, there are more than 1,000 monasteries in India in exile, but there are only, less than 200 for women. And none of those are very hospitable to Western nuns. We have visa problems, we have health problems, we have language problems. And unfortunately, even though Tibetan Buddhism has been in the West for 50 years, we still only have 3 centers in the world that don't charge us to stay there. And most of the centers are geared towards the needs of lay people. And 2 of those centers that don't charge are run by lamas accused of sexually abusing their students. So that's the real situation. If you ordain, there isn't much support, but there is a really meaningful life, So I met a Theravadan nun who was traveling the world, just living on the economy of goodness. And I started to stay in Theravadan centers, and I realized that they have a completely different take on monasticism, that they hold monastics as a field of refuge, as a field of good karma, and that traditional Theravadan Buddhists regard monastics with high esteem, as they did in Himalayan societies. It's only because the Tibetans are refugees that this system of support has broken down for Westerners. It is, in fact, the duty of a teacher who ordains a student, a monastic, to make sure they have proper training and support. And you shouldn't just ordain and wander here and there wherever you want. You should make sure that you have support, that you have training. And that doesn't really exist right now. And therefore, we have an 80 to 90% disrobing rate. What I noticed was, there was a wealth of opportunity to engage with society, to share goodness, to share meditation. And I found those things were very much needed in the world. And I was happy to share what I knew of the Dhamma. But I also saw there was a major shortfall with training for monastics. I received some of my Vinaya training in Theravadan monasteries, and I just found, finally, this is how a nun is meant to live. But of course, even in those monasteries, I also encountered sexism. For example, one time I was walking down a path and a monk saw me, and he just turned around and walked in the other direction, like he didn't even say hello, because he wanted to avoid being alone with a woman. And I just found that literal interpretation of the Vinaya quite oppressive and disrespectful to women. We all have to share this world, so if you have aversion to women, don't ordain. Yeah, and I did, once again find sexism in that tradition. The kind of sexism that exists in Theravada in terms of people refusing nuns full ordination, even though a lot of research has been done to show that bhikkhunis fully ordained nuns have always existed, and that the tradition can be revived. All that research has been done, and the people who refuse to accept it, like Amaravati Monastery in England, who made these 5 points, which basically said nuns are subservient to monks. Nuns don't get to decide who ordains in their community. If a monk is present, nuns should be silent unless invited to teach. It was so regressive, and kind of indicated to me that a lot of people in Buddhism have, are spiritually bypassing and have internalized patriarchy. Growing up in Australia, I never really felt particularly oppressed by gender. My parents told me I could do whatever I wanted. But as a street kid, I was exposed to what can happen when no one else is present, and some men, not all men, indulge in their worst repressed fantasies about women and how they objectify women and abuse women when no one else is watching. But it was more, when I became a Buddhist nun, that I clearly saw there were significant issues around abuse and not regarding women as equal human beings, and not being aware of keeping women safe, and, being aware of lamas using their power to have sexual relationship with their students, which is so inappropriate and a bit like a psychologist sleeping with their client. Of course, not all lamas are monks. Many of them are married or lay, and there are many good lamas. But the whole system, is a hierarchy with men at the top, and, people who are Western are not regarded as equal, not regarded as having the same training, and the training is, 20 years and very elaborate. I did that training for 4 years in India, but I didn't find it particularly helpful to me. I found it was very intellectual, quite dry. Um, I really respect the people who do find it useful and who benefit from that and who finish the course. There are now female geshes, which is like a doctorate of divinity, and there are a few Western women who've almost completed the geshe degree. But I don't think, I think we probably need more culturally appropriate forms of training that integrate psychology and look at power dynamics and are more socially engaged, more accessible to Western women. Most Western women who ordain are over 50. I ordained at 23, and I do think we need better facilities for young people to ordain, because a community without young people ordaining is a community that doesn't have a future. And it's much harder to change and adjust to communal life, But if you just ordain and stay with all your money and you don't help anyone and you don't move out of your house, although, some people do that when they're older because they want their independence and they don't want to live in community, I still kind of question, like, are you getting the training you need? Are you helping create a community and a legacy for future monastics and for people to be able to practice? So I would say to anyone considering ordination, really look at your motivation, look at what you're running away from, because it will come right back at you in your face. And it won't just be all walking on clouds. You'll face some significant inner challenges. Your emotional issues will rise up, your shadow side will rise up. And that's part of the beauty, the challenge, the transformation of becoming a monastic. I feel that now after 20 years of saving, I finally managed to buy land for a monastery, and I'd like to create something that is female-led and that is inclusive of non-binary people, trans people, more accessible, more socially engaged, but also embraces things like environmental living, social justice, and so on. As well as, creating a place that really doesn't exist for women. There's so few places led by women where people have ordination, and, where the understanding of justice is included in those monasteries. So I've created a fusion of Theravada and Mahayana, which I call the Mahayana forest tradition, which is living a lot like the original monks in the time of the Buddha did, in small huts, in simplicity, but also, traveling and serving society, and, being in touch with the issues of contemporary life, such as climate change, such as the wage gap, such as gender equality, and so forth. Combining those things with the deep spiritual practice that the Buddha gave us. So on the whole, would I suggest that people ordain? I would say it's really not an easy life, and it's not an escape, and also a lot of people disrobe simply because they have no financial support. I would say that you should stay with a teacher, that you should learn the Vinaya, and the best place to get that training in the current world would be in the Theravada tradition. But I love the philosophy of Tibetan Buddhism. I love the Bodhisattva ideal. So perhaps, occasionally go and study with Western female teachers, or, Buddhist teachers committed to equality and keeping their students safe from abuse. And don't surrender your own wisdom, your own rationality. Don't become part of a cult. You do have the wisdom within you to seek the truth, and be guided by the early suttas in the Pali Canon, and the commentaries, and find good spiritual friends, because building community is an often underestimated part of Buddhism. So that's just my short take on being a nun, and you know, some kind of brief introduction to monastic life. Thanks a lot and have a great day.